Montana Territory, 1873. Vaughn Quincy squinted against the harsh sun, his weathered hat pulled low as he surveyed the sprawling ranch before him. The journey had been long. 3 weeks of hard riding from Kansas after the cattle drive had ended with empty pockets and broken promises. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when he'd finished the last of his hardtack. The only thing he had left was his horse, his saddle, and the clothes on his back. The sign at the entrance read Aspen Creek Ranch, in elegant lettering that seemed out of place against the rugged backdrop of the Montana Territory. Rumors in town suggested they were hiring, and at this point, Vaughn couldn't afford to be choosy. As he approached the main house, a surprisingly grand two-story structure with a wide porch and intricate woodwork, Vaughn noticed how everything about the property spoke of prosperity. The corrals were newly built with straight pine posts. The barn was larger than any he'd seen outside of Kansas City, and the cattle in the nearby pastures looked healthy and well-tended. "State your business," a gruff voice called out. Vaughn turned to see a man in his 50s, shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. The foreman, Vaughn guessed. "Looking for work," Vaughn replied, straightening in his saddle. "Heard in town you might be hiring." The man's eyes swept over Vaughn's worn clothes and thin frame before nodding. "You got experience?" 10 years riding. Work drives from Texas to Kansas. Can break horses, mend fences, and shoot straight." The foreman considered him a moment. "The owner will want to interview you herself. Step down and follow me." Vaughn tied his horse to the hitching post, following the foreman up the porch steps. He removed his hat, running a hand through his sun-bleached hair as he entered the house. The interior was as impressive as the outside. Polished wood floors, actual wallpaper, and furnishings that must have cost a small fortune to ship out this far. The foreman led him to a study at the back of the house. "Wait here. Miss Abernathy will be with you shortly." Left alone, Vaughn resisted the urge to collapse into one of the leather chairs. Instead, he stood at attention, hat in hand, determined to make a proper impression on whoever this Miss Abernathy was. Probably the wife or daughter of some wealthy Easterner who'd bought up land. He'd met the type before, women who viewed ranch life as a quaint adventure, safely observed from behind lace curtains. The door opened, and Vaughn turned, expecting a delicate society woman. Instead, he found himself facing a woman unlike any he'd encountered before. She wore a practical riding skirt and crisp white blouse, her chestnut hair pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She couldn't have been more than 25, but there was nothing youthful in her steady gaze as she assessed him with clear green eyes. "Mister," she prompted, extending her hand. "Quincy, ma'am. Vaughn Quincy." He hesitated before shaking her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Catherine Abernathy," she replied. "Please sit." Vaughn lowered himself into the chair opposite her desk, watching as she took her seat with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "Joseph tells me you're looking for work." "Yes, ma'am." "Experience?" 10 years cowboying." "I can." "References?" she interrupted. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably. "Last outfit I rode with was the Bar X out of Dodge. Foreman's name is Hank Miller." Catherine nodded, making a note in a leather-bound ledger. "And before that?" "Circle M in Texas. Triple R in Colorado. Started as a boy with the Lazy S in Kansas." She studied him for a moment. "You move around a lot, Mr. Quincy." It wasn't a question, but Vaughn felt compelled to answer. "Nature of the work, ma'am. Not on my ranch." Her gaze was direct, unwavering. "I need men who will stay, who will invest themselves in the success of Aspen Creek. Not drifters looking for a winter's wages before moving on." Vaughn bristled at being so quickly categorized. "With all due respect, Miss Abernathy, I go where the work is. If the work's steady and the pay's fair, I stay put." A slight smile touched her lips. "Fair enough. The position pays $30 a month, plus room and board. Days start before dawn and end when the work is done. Sundays are yours unless there's an emergency. No drinking on the property, no fighting, and absolutely no trouble with the local townspeople. We pride ourselves on being good neighbors." $30 was better than he'd expected, especially with meals included. "Yes, ma'am. You'll report to Joseph Hendricks, my foreman. He'll assign your duties and show you to the bunkhouse." She paused. "I should warn you, Mr. Quincy, that I run this ranch myself. Not through a husband or a father or a brother. Every decision, every dollar, every head of cattle, It all comes back to me. If that's going to be a problem for you, best we know now. Vaughn had worked for female ranch owners before, though they'd typically been widows who relied heavily on their foreman. Something told him Catherine Abernathy wasn't relying on anyone. No problem at all, Miss Abernathy. I respect anyone who knows their business, man or woman. She nodded, apparently satisfied. Then we understand each other. You'll be on a month's probation. After that, we'll discuss a more permanent arrangement. She stood, extending her hand again. Welcome to Aspen Creek, Mr. Quincy. As Vaughn stepped back into the sunlight, following Hendricks toward the bunkhouse, he couldn't help but feel he'd just encountered a force of nature disguised as a woman in a riding skirt. Whatever he'd expected when he rode through those gates, it certainly wasn't Catherine Abernathy. The first week at Aspen Creek passed in a blur of exhaustion and aching muscles. Vaughn worked from before sunrise until well after dark, determined to prove his worth during the probationary period. The other hands, a mix of seasoned cowboys and local men, were reserved at first, but gradually warmed to him as they saw he wasn't afraid of hard work. It was during his second week that Vaughn began to understand the true scope of Aspen Creek. He'd been sent with 3 other men to check fence lines along the eastern boundary, a journey that took them 2 full days of riding. How much land does Miss Abernathy own? Vaughn asked Tom Riley, a weathered cowboy who'd been with the ranch for 5 years. Tom chuckled. More than you can see from here, that's for certain. Aspen Creek proper is about 20,000 acres, but she's got other holdings too. Other holdings? Oh yes. The lady's got interests in half the territory, I'd wager. Timber rights in the mountains, shares in the mines, parcels all through the valley. Tom shook his head in admiration. They say her father started with nothing but 100 acres and a dream back in '49. By the time he passed, he'd built an empire. Miss Catherine's only expanded it since taking over. Vaughn digested this information silently. He'd assumed Catherine Abernathy was merely the daughter of a successful rancher, perhaps managing the family property until a brother returned or a husband took over. The idea that she was the sole proprietor of what sounded like a vast fortune was unexpected. She doesn't act like a rich woman, he observed. Tom laughed outright at this. What were you expecting? Some hoity-toity lady with frilly parasols? Miss Catherine was born in a cabin not much bigger than our bunkhouse. Grew up learning the business from the ground up. She could outride, outshoot, and outwork most men by the time she was 16. Her father taught her the business? Vaughn asked, surprised. Most men he knew wouldn't dream of teaching their daughters ranch management. Had to. Her mother died when she was young, and there weren't any sons. Old William Abernathy was practical, if nothing else. Knew the girl had a head for figures and a spine of steel. Perfect combination for ranching. As they rode back toward the main house on the third day, Vaughn found himself seeing the property with new eyes. The careful management of water resources, the strategic placement of windbreaks, the meticulous breeding program for the cattle, all of it spoke of someone with vision and intelligence. The sound of gunshots drew their attention as they approached the ranch. In a small clearing behind the barn, Catherine stood with a Winchester repeating rifle, systematically firing at targets set up on fence posts. Even from a distance, Vaughn could see she was hitting each one dead center. Told you she could shoot, Tom muttered with a note of pride. Vaughn reined in his horse, watching as Catherine reloaded with practiced efficiency. Her movements were precise, economical, nothing wasted. When she raised the rifle again, her stance was perfect, feet planted shoulder-width apart, body angled slightly, cheek resting confidently against the stock. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Vaughn found himself captivated by the sight. There was something undeniably appealing about competence, about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And Catherine Abernathy clearly knew what she was doing. As if sensing his scrutiny, Catherine lowered the rifle and turned. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a brief moment, Vaughn felt something pass between them. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. Then she nodded once and returned to her shooting. Best not to stare at the boss lady, Tom advised with a knowing smirk. She doesn't take kindly to being gawked at. Vaughn nodded, urging his horse forward. But even as they continued toward the barn, he found himself glancing back, wondering what other surprises Catherine Abernathy might have in store. The autumn days grew shorter, and Vaughn settled into the rhythm of life at Aspen Creek. His probation period ended with a brief meeting in Catherine's study. where she offered him a permanent position with a small raise. He accepted immediately, surprising himself with how quickly the ranch had begun to feel like home. October brought the fall roundup, a massive undertaking that required every hand on the property working from dawn until dusk. Vaughn found himself assigned to Catherine's team, riding alongside her as they gathered cattle from the high country before the first snow. "You handle yourself well on a horse, Mr. Quincy," she observed on their third day out, as they paused to water their mounts at a small creek. "Thank you, ma'am. Been riding since before I could walk properly." "Texas-born?" "Yes, ma'am. Outside of San Antonio." She nodded, studying the distant mountains. "What brought you all the way to Montana?" Vaughn hesitated. His usual answer was simple, following the work, but something made him offer more. "After the war, Texas felt changed. Too many ghosts. Figured I'd keep heading north until I found somewhere that felt right." "And have you?" "Found somewhere that feels right." Their eyes met, and Vaughn was struck by the genuine interest in her gaze. "Beginning to think I might have," he admitted. A shadow of a smile crossed her face before she turned back to her horse. "Good hands are hard to find in this country. Even harder to keep." Before he could respond, a shout from one of the other cowboys drew their attention to a group of cattle breaking away from the main herd. Catherine was in the saddle in one fluid motion, spurring her horse toward the escapees with Vaughn close behind. They worked in tandem, cutting off the runaways and guiding them back toward the herd. Vaughn couldn't help but admire Catherine's riding. She handled her horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, anticipating the cattle's movements and countering them effortlessly. As the days of the roundup continued, Vaughn found himself increasingly drawn to Catherine. It wasn't just her beauty, though she possessed a striking loveliness that needed no enhancement from fashionable dresses or elaborate hairstyles. It was her mind, sharp, practical, observant, and her unwavering dedication to the ranch and its people. She knew every employee by name, understood their strengths and weaknesses, and matched tasks to talents with remarkable precision. She could discuss breeding bloodlines with the same expertise she applied to water rights negotiations. And despite her wealth and position, she never hesitated to do the dirty work alongside her men, whether it was pulling a calf in the middle of a frigid night or digging irrigation ditches under the merciless summer sun. One evening, as they sat around the campfire after a long day, Vaughn found himself watching Catherine across the flames. She was deep in conversation with her foreman, discussing the next day's plans, her face animated in the firelight. When she glanced up and caught him looking, Vaughn expected her to frown or look away. Instead, she held his gaze for a long moment before the corners of her mouth lifted in a small, private smile. It was nothing, a mere second of connection in the midst of a busy roundup, and yet Vaughn felt it like a physical touch. He looked down at his coffee cup, startled by his reaction and unsure what to make of it. Later that night, as he lay in his bedroll staring at the stars, Vaughn acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling for Catherine Abernathy. It was as hopeless as it was inevitable. The hired hand pining for the wealthy rancher, a tale as old as time and just as doomed. Catherine might treat her employees fairly, might even enjoy his company on occasion, but the distance between them was measured in more than just dollars. She was building an empire. He was just passing through. Women like Catherine didn't marry men like him, men with empty pockets and uncertain futures. Vaughn resolved to keep his feelings to himself. He'd found good work with good pay, and he wouldn't risk that by making a fool of himself over the boss. Besides, he told himself as sleep finally claimed him, Catherine Abernathy could have any man she wanted. There was no reason to think she'd ever look twice at a poor cowboy like him. Winter descended on Montana with unforgiving swiftness. One day the hills were painted with the russet and gold of late autumn. The next they were blanketed in white, the landscape transformed by the season's first major snowstorm. Life at Aspen Creek slowed to a more measured pace. The cattle had been moved to sheltered winter pastures, and the daily work shifted to maintenance tasks, repairing equipment, chopping endless cords of firewood, and ensuring the livestock had access to feed and unfrozen water. In December, Catherine announced plans for a Christmas celebration at the main house. All hands and their families are invited, she told the assembled cowboys one evening in the bunkhouse. There'll be food, music, and gifts for the children. I expect to see all of you there. The holiday gathering was apparently an Aspen Creek tradition, one the men spoke of with genuine enthusiasm. Even the most taciturn cowboys seemed to brighten at the prospect of a proper celebration to break the monotony of winter. On Christmas Eve, Vaughn found himself standing awkwardly in the corner of Catherine's parlor, watching as families filled the spacious room with laughter and conversation. The house had been transformed with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and dozens of candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. A massive tree stood in the center of the room, decorated with paper ornaments, strings of cranberries, and small wrapped packages. Catherine moved among her guests with easy grace, kneeling to speak with children at their level, drawing shy wives into conversation, and ensuring everyone had enough to eat from the laden tables in the dining room. She wore a dress of deep green velvet that complemented her eyes and highlighted the rich chestnut of her hair, which for once was arranged in loose curls around her shoulders rather than its usual practical knot. "You look like a man contemplating either proposal or robbery," a voice observed dryly. Vaughn turned to find Joseph Hendricks beside him. The foreman's weathered face creased in amusement. "Just enjoying the party," Vaughn replied, uncomfortable with how easily his thoughts had been read. Joseph snorted. "You haven't taken your eyes off Miss Catherine all evening. Can't say I blame you. She's quite something, isn't she?" Vaughn remained silent, neither confirming nor denying the observation. "Word of advice," Joseph continued, his voice dropping. "The lady doesn't care about a man's bank account or his family connections. Never has. What she values is honesty, hard work, and backbone. Just something to consider." Before Vaughn could respond, Joseph clapped him on the shoulder and moved away, leaving him to mull over the unexpected counsel. Later that evening, as the party began to wind down, Vaughn found himself alone in the hallway, examining a painting of what appeared to be Aspen Creek in its early days. Little more than a cabin and a small corral set against the backdrop of the mountains. "My father commissioned that when I was 12, Catherine said, appearing beside him, "to remind us of how far we'd come." "It's a remarkable achievement," Vaughn replied, genuinely impressed. "Building all this from nothing." "Not nothing," she corrected gently. "He had vision, determination, and willing hands. Those are worth more than gold in this country." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, shoulder to shoulder before the painting. Vaughn was acutely aware of her proximity, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of how the candlelight softened her features. "I have something for you," Catherine said suddenly, reaching into the pocket of her dress. She withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas, Vaughn." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice did strange things to his pulse. He accepted the package with surprise. I don't have anything for you. I don't expect gifts from my employees, Mr. Quincy." The formality was back, but there was warmth in her eyes that belied it. "Open it." Vaughn carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a leather-bound journal with his initials embossed on the cover. Inside, the pages were blank, waiting to be filled. "You mentioned once that you like to write down your thoughts," Catherine explained. "I thought perhaps you might enjoy having a proper place for them." The thoughtfulness of the gift left Vaughn momentarily speechless. It was true. He had a habit of jotting down observations and memories in a tattered notebook he kept in his saddlebags. But he'd only mentioned it once, in passing, during a long day of writing fence lines. The fact that Catherine had remembered, had noticed something so personal about him. "Thank you," he said finally, meeting her gaze. It's perfect." Something passed between them in that moment. A current of connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even friendship. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, as if she too felt the shift, before she took a small step back. "Well," she said, her voice not quite steady, "I should see to my other guests. Enjoy the rest of the evening, Mr. Quincy." As she walked away, Vaughn remained by the painting, the journal clutched in his hands, his heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. Joseph's words echoed in his mind. The lady doesn't care about a man's bank account or his family connections. For the first time since recognizing his feelings for Catherine, Vaughn allowed himself to wonder if perhaps they weren't as hopeless as he'd believed. January brought bitter cold and a crisis that would change everything. A devastating blizzard swept down from Canada, burying the ranch under 4 feet of snow and driving temperatures well below zero. For 3 days, The storm raged unabated, confining everyone to shelter and cutting off communication with the outside world. When the skies finally cleared, Catherine called a meeting of all hands. "We need to check on the cattle in the north pasture," she announced, her face grave. "They're in the most exposed position, and I'm worried about drift fencing giving way." "With respect, Miss Abernathy," Joseph argued, "the snow's too deep for regular travel. We need to go on snowshoes, and that's a good 10 miles each way." "I'm aware of the difficulty," Catherine replied. "I'm not asking anyone to go. I'll make the trip myself." A chorus of protests erupted from the assembled men. Vaughn stepped forward. "I'll go with you." Catherine met his eyes. "It's dangerous, Mr. Quincy. All the more reason you shouldn't go alone." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Very well. We'll leave at first light. The rest of you, focus on clearing paths to the barn and stables. If we're not back by tomorrow evening, Joseph is in charge." Dawn found Catherine and Vaughn preparing for the journey. They dressed in layers, packed emergency supplies, and strapped on the snowshoes that would allow them to traverse the deep drifts. The morning was clear but brutally cold, their breath crystallizing instantly in the frigid air. "Last chance to change your mind," Catherine said as they stood at the edge of the ranch compound, the vast white wilderness stretching before them. "Not a chance," Vaughn replied. "Lead on, Miss Abernathy." The journey was grueling. Even with snowshoes, they sank deep into the drifts, each step requiring significant effort. They moved in single file, taking turns breaking trail through the pristine snow. By midday, they had covered perhaps half the distance, their progress slowed by the need to navigate around impassable drifts and fallen trees. "We should rest," Vaughn suggested, noticing Catherine's labored breathing. "Just for a few minutes." She nodded, too exhausted to argue. They found shelter in a small copse of pines, the trees having created a pocket of relatively shallow snow. Vaughn cleared a space for them to sit and pulled out a flask of hot coffee from his pack. "Drink," he urged, passing it to Catherine. "It'll help." She accepted gratefully, the coffee bringing color back to her wind-chapped cheeks. "Thank you for coming with me," she said after a moment. "It was foolish to think I could make this journey alone." "No more foolish than me thinking I could impress you by volunteering," Vaughn replied with a small smile. Catherine looked at him sharply. "Is that why you came? To impress me?" "Partly," he admitted. "Mostly I came because I couldn't bear the thought of you facing this alone." Something in his tone made her study him more closely. "You've been different since Christmas. More reserved around me." Vaughn looked away, focusing on the distant mountains. "I've been trying to maintain appropriate boundaries." "Boundaries," she repeated softly. "Between employer and employee." "Yes. And if I said I sometimes wish those boundaries weren't quite so well maintained?" Vaughn's head snapped back to her, certain he'd misheard. Catherine met his gaze steadily, though a flush that had nothing to do with the cold spread across her cheeks. "Catherine," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. The moment was broken by a distant sound, the unmistakable bawling of cattle in distress. Catherine was on her feet immediately, all personal matters forgotten in the face of the potential crisis. "They've broken through the fencing," she said, strapping her snowshoes back on. "We need to hurry." The final miles passed in grim determination. As they crested the last ridge, they were met with a devastating sight. The drift fence had indeed collapsed under the weight of the snow, and perhaps 100 head of cattle had wandered into a steep ravine. From their vantage point, Vaughn could see some animals already down in the snow, while others huddled together against the bitter wind. "We need to get them moving toward that stand of cottonwoods," Catherine said, pointing to a cluster of trees that offered natural shelter. "It's their only chance until help can arrive." For the next several hours, they worked tirelessly to save the cattle. Moving on snowshoes through the deep drifts, they managed to guide most of the herd toward the relative protection of the trees. Some animals were too weak to move, and these they covered with evergreen boughs to provide minimal shelter until they could return with sleds and more men. The short winter day was fading by the time they had done all they could. Both were exhausted, their clothes soaked with sweat despite the bitter cold. As they prepared to begin the long journey back to the ranch, Catherine suddenly swayed on her feet. "Just tired," she insisted when Vaughn steadied her. But her face was alarmingly pale, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. "We need to find shelter," Vaughn decided, scanning the darkening landscape. We'll never make it back to the ranch tonight, and you're showing signs of exposure. There's a lined shack about a mile east, Catherine said, her voice weaker than Vaughn liked. Used during summer grazing. With Catherine leaning increasingly on his support, they made their way to the small cabin. It was basic, just 4 walls, a roof, and a stone fireplace, but it was shelter from the wind and cold. Vaughn helped Catherine inside and immediately set about building a fire with the wood stacked beside the hearth. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Vaughn turned his attention to Catherine. Her condition had deteriorated during their final trek to the cabin. She was shivering violently, her movements clumsy as she tried to remove her snow-encrusted outer layers. "Let me help," he said, kneeling before her. He gently removed her gloves, coat, and boots, alarmed by how cold her hands and feet felt. "Your clothes are damp. You need to change into something dry." Catherine nodded woodenly, too disoriented to argue. Vaughn found a rough blanket on the single cot and held it up as a screen while Catherine changed into the spare shirt and trousers he offered from his pack. When she was done, he wrapped her in the blanket and his own dry coat, then guided her to sit close to the fire. "Drink this," he urged, pressing a cup of hot broth made from bouillon cubes into her hands. Small sips. As the cabin warmed and the hot liquid did its work, Catherine's shivering gradually subsided. Color returned to her face, and her eyes regained their usual clarity. "Better?" Vaughn asked, still watching her with concern. "Much," she replied, managing a small smile. "I don't know what happened. I've never faded like that before." "Exhaustion and cold are a dangerous combination," Vaughn said. "You pushed yourself too hard today." "We both did." She reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers warm now against his skin. "Thank you, Vaughn, for coming with me, for saving the cattle, for taking care of me." The intimacy of the moment, alone in the small cabin, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, Catherine's touch against his face, threatened to overwhelm Vaughn's carefully maintained restraint. He caught her hand in his, intending to return it to her side, to restore the proper distance between them. But Catherine turned her palm against his, interlacing their fingers. "Earlier today," she said quietly, "before we heard the cattle, you were about to say something." Vaughn met her gaze, finding no trace of the disorientation that had worried him earlier. Instead, her eyes held a question, the same one that had lingered between them since Christmas, perhaps even longer. "I was going to say," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "that I've been fighting how I feel about you since the moment I set foot on Aspen Creek. That I know it's impossible. You're Catherine Abernathy, and I'm just a hired hand with nothing to my name. But that doesn't stop me from—" He trailed off, unable to finish the declaration. Catherine's grip on his hand tightened. "From what?" she prompted softly. "From falling in love with you," he admitted, the words hanging in the warm air between them. Catherine was still for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if she were as unsure of this new territory as he was. Then Vaughn's arms went around her, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing finally acknowledged, of barriers finally broken. When they pulled apart, Catherine's eyes were bright with emotion. "Do you think I care about your bank account? That I would measure a man's worth by the size of his holdings rather than the content of his character?" "It's not about what you think," Vaughn replied. "It's about what you deserve. You've built something remarkable here. I couldn't bear to be the man who comes into your life empty-handed." Catherine shook her head, a mix of exasperation and tenderness in her expression. "Vaughn Quincy, for a smart man, you can be remarkably dense. What I've built is meaningless without someone to share it with. Someone who sees me, not the property, not the cattle, not the bank accounts. Just me." She cupped his face between her palms. "And you see me. You always have." This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The blanket slipped from Catherine's shoulders as Vaughn pulled her onto his lap, his arms encircling her waist as her hands threaded through his hair. "I love you," she whispered against his mouth. "I think I started falling the day you walked into my study, hat in hand, too proud to admit you were half-starved but determined to work for your place." Vaughn laughed softly. "Was I that transparent? To me?" "Yes." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I see you too, Vaughn. All of you. They spent the night wrapped in each other's arms, sharing stories and kisses beside the dying fire. Outside, the temperature plummeted and stars blazed in the clear black sky. But inside the small cabin, there was only warmth and the newfound joy of barriers finally broken, of love finally spoken aloud. Spring came early to Montana that year, the snow melting from the valleys by mid-March and the first wildflowers appearing on south-facing slopes. At Aspen Creek, the season brought a flurry of activity, calving, planting, and preparations for the summer grazing season. It also brought whispers and speculation among the hands. Since their return from the fateful journey to the North Pasture, something had clearly changed between Miss Abernathy and Vaughn Quincy. Nothing improper. Catherine was too conscious of her position and the example she set to allow for gossip, but there was an undeniable shift in the way they interacted. The formal Mr. Quincy and Miss Abernathy had given way to Vaughn and Catherine, at least in private. They were often seen riding together, heads bent in conversation. And sometimes, in unguarded moments, their gazes would meet across the dining room or stable yard with a warmth that spoke volumes. On a perfect day in late April, Catherine asked Vaughn to accompany her to check on a new irrigation project near the eastern boundary. They rode side by side through meadows lush with new grass, the mountains still capped with snow against the brilliant blue sky. "I have a proposal for you," Catherine said as they dismounted near a small stream. "Is that so?" Vaughn replied, tying their horses to a nearby sapling. "I'm listening." Catherine took his hand, leading him to sit beside her on a fallen log. "I've been thinking about the future, about Aspen Creek, and what I want for it. For us." Vaughn's heart quickened at the us, still sometimes unable to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen him. "The ranch is growing," Catherine continued. "We're expanding the herd, improving the bloodlines. I've acquired additional grazing rights in the high country. The railroad's coming through next year, which will make getting cattle to market much easier." "You've been busy," Vaughn observed with a smile. "Is this proposal about work, then? A promotion from ranch hand to what? Head wrangler?" Catherine shook her head, suddenly serious. "No, Vaughn. I'm asking you to be my partner. In everything." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into his palm. Vaughn looked down to find a simple gold ring resting against his calloused skin. "It was my father's," Catherine explained. "He wore it every day of his marriage to my mother. I thought it might fit you." Vaughn stared at the ring, momentarily speechless. "Catherine, are you asking?" "Yes," she said simply. "I'm asking you to marry me, Vaughn Quincy, to build Aspen Creek with me, to share my life, my home, my future." She paused, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Unless I've misunderstood, and this isn't what you want." Vaughn closed his fingers around the ring, then pulled Catherine to her feet and into his arms. "You haven't misunderstood anything," he murmured against her hair. "I love you more than I ever thought possible. But are you certain? There will be talk. People will say you could have done better, married someone with wealth or connections." Catherine leaned back to look at him, her eyes clear and determined. "Let them talk. I'm not marrying a bank account or a family name or a pedigree. I'm marrying the man I love. The man who rode out into a blizzard with me without hesitation. The man who sees me as Catherine, not as Aspen Creek Ranch." She took the ring from his hand and held it up. "So what do you say, Cowboy? Will you take the job of being my husband? I should warn you, the hours are long, the boss is demanding, and there's no quitting once you start." Vaughn laughed, joy bubbling up inside him like a spring. "Sounds like the best job offer I've ever had," he said, holding out his hand. The ring slid onto his finger as if it had been made for him. Vaughn pulled Catherine close, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. "I rode into Aspen Creek with nothing but an empty stomach and the clothes on my back," he said when they finally parted. "Now I find myself the richest man in Montana." Catherine smiled up at him, love shining in her eyes. "And I find myself the luckiest woman." Their wedding took place on a perfect June day, with the entire ranch turned out to celebrate. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to suit her more practical tastes, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a formal veil. Vaughn, looking somewhat uncomfortable in a new suit, waited for her beneath an arch of twisted willow branches erected on the lawn before the main house. As Catherine walked toward him on Joseph's arm, the foreman having proudly accepted the honor of giving her away, Vaughn thought his heart might burst from happiness. This extraordinary woman, intelligent, capable, kind, and more beautiful than any person had a right to be, was choosing him, Vaughn Quincy, former drifter and hired hand. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not just of love and fidelity, but of partnership, respect, and shared purpose. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the assembled ranch hands and neighbors seemed to echo all the way to the distant mountains. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing and feasting under lanterns strung across the yard. As twilight deepened into darkness, Vaughn found Catherine standing slightly apart from the festivities, gazing out across the land they now officially shared. "Having second thoughts, Mrs. Quincy?" he asked, coming up behind her and slipping his arms around her waist. Catherine leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Not a single one, Mr. Quincy. Just thinking about how far we've come. How far we still have to go. Together," Vaughn reminded her, pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. "Together," she agreed, turning in his arms to face him. "Do you know what today is, besides our wedding day?" Vaughn raised an eyebrow in question. "It's exactly 1 year since you rode through those gates looking for work," Catherine said. "1 year since you took a job with a ranch woman, not knowing she owned half the state." Vaughn laughed, tightening his arms around her. "Best decision I ever made, even if I did underestimate the size of your holdings. And now those holdings are yours too," Catherine pointed out. "By law, at least a portion of everything I own became yours when we said our vows. I didn't marry you for your land or your cattle, Catherine. I know." She reached up to touch his face tenderly. "Just as I didn't marry you for your strong back or your way with horses, though both are admittedly impressive." They shared a smile, the private smile of lovers who understand each other completely. Behind them, the music and laughter of their wedding celebration continued, but for a moment, they existed in their own world, bound by something far stronger than legal documents or material possessions. "I love you, Catherine Quincy," Vaughn said softly. "And I promise you, I will work every day of my life to be worthy of you." "You already are," she replied, standing on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "Now, take me home, husband. We have a lifetime to begin." Hand in hand, they walked back to the celebration, toward their future together. The poor cowboy who had once taken a job with a ranch woman now stood beside her as an equal partner in all things. And as the stars emerged one by one in the vast Montana sky, Aspen Creek Ranch stretched out before them, not just a piece of land, but a legacy they would build together, one day at a time, for all the years to come.